Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to be going over how to set up Redux Toolkit, how it differs from the regular Redux, and we're going to build a very simple application using it. Now, I recently got into Redux Toolkit because some of you guys suggested after seeing my Redux video that I look into it because it was easier to use than Redux, and I have to say I was pretty impressed when I factored it over into one of my new projects that I'm personally working on. Now, this Redux Toolkit is something that I think you will understand better if you have a background in the regular Redux library. So I recommend watching that video on that library first. But if you don't, you can still use Redux Toolkit as your first state management library for React. You might just not understand exactly what's going on under the hood as much as with regular Redux, and why Redux Toolkit is such a welcome change to the Redux ecosystem. It is also important to know that Redux Toolkit is made by the same people that made Redux, and they had all these improvements in mind. So if you find value in this video, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or liking the video. It helps so much with the YouTube algorithm, and I love reading every single comment that you guys read, and I love taking those suggestions and putting them into my new videos every single week that I post. So let's jump straight into it. As you can see, I've created a very simple React application in codesandbox.io, and all it does is it says the count has an increment and decrement button. So essentially, we just have a counter that doesn't do anything, and we're going to add the implementation using Redux Toolkit. So if you click Get Started, it'll give you a little information about the purpose of why they started Redux Toolkit and stuff like that. A lot of it having to be that Redux is a bit complicated for beginners and a lot of boilerplate code to set up, and that's why this is such a welcome change, because it really simplifies the setup a bit, and it also simplifies the code quite a bit, which is one of the main reasons I switched in my project. So if you're familiar with Redux, you'll know that we use something called createStore to create the actual store. Well, for Redux Toolkit, they use something called configureStore instead. And all it really does is it simply does the same thing as createStore, but it automatically combines some of your reducers in an easier to understand way, and it also adds a couple of cool middlewares like Redux DevTools, which is pretty useful if you're trying to debug a Redux application. But we'll get into all of this stuff when we actually start using it. So let's go ahead and first of all, let's install Redux.js into Redux Toolkit into our application. So if you're following along on VS Code, you can type this into your terminal. If not, you can just simply go to Code Sandbox, click the Add Dependency button, and type Redux Toolkit. Let's go ahead and copy this in exactly, that way we get the right library, and there we go. So you can see I've added the library, and now we can go ahead and set it up. So following the basic tutorial, the tutorials on this website are pretty much split into 3 parts. I looked at every single one of them. The last one in the advanced tutorial has to do with TypeScript. So if you're setting something up in TypeScript, it's useful to check out that advanced tutorial after learning the basics from this basics one. So first of all, what the documentation will do is it'll show you essentially what a basic application would look like if you were to implement it in just regular Redux. And what they are trying to show is sort of the difference. So over here, if you follow the Ducks method for Redux, which is essentially just a way of saying you put everything that your reducer needs in a single file, and you know about Redux, you'll know that your reducer is going to need the action name, the actions function, the actual reducer that does something to your state depending on what the values you have and what actions you have, and then you're creating the store, and that is pretty much it. Now with Redux Toolkit, instead of using createStore like that, you can use configureStore and pass in whatever reducers that you want. Instead of using, for example, creating an action name and then creating the action in this way, you can use a simple function called createAction that will create that action and pass in just the name of it, and that will create the action name as well as the action that you can call. And if you're new to Redux, I highly recommend watching the first Redux video in my video series that will show you exactly what actions are and stuff like that. But just to give you a quick rundown, the way it works is in React code, when you call an action, it will trigger a reducer, which is an external state. You can think of it as like sort of a place where you can store variables that, you know, any React component can access, which is why it's useful to have very simply. So then the example it gives us next is essentially using that increment. It's showing us that if you were to look at the increment.type, it would return that string that you passed in when you created it. Now, I'm going through this a bit fast because there's something at the bottom that I want to get to. Now, they're showing you examples of how to use all of these things individually, like, for example, create action and create reducer, which you would do in regular Redux anyways. But the real great thing about Redux Toolkit is when you get to these things called slices. It allows you to create something called a slice, which is sort of its own reducer that you can pass in action names as well as the reducers, as well as anything else you would need for your reducer. So for example, right here, this like 7 lines of code is the entire reducer that will perform the increment and decrement functionality that we saw all the way up here when they gave the example of how to do it in regular Redux. This is what it would look like in regular Redux to do everything. So pretty much all of this. And when you use a Redux slice, you can simplify it down to this. Or sorry, whoops. You can simplify it down to this. Now, in a slice, there are a couple of different things you can pass in. You can pass in the name, which is mostly for internal use. And your name sort of specifies, will help out, for example, if you have multiple slices / reducers so that they don't conflict. You can pass in an initial state. In this case, because they're just using this for a counter, they've set their initial state to a variable, but obviously some reducers / slices will get bigger, so you can set it to a map of values. And then in the reducers, they are declaring the actions in the same place that they are essentially declaring the functionality for that action. So in this case, when you call the increment action, it's going to increment the state by 1. When you call the decrement action, it's going to decrement the state by 1 as well. So that's pretty much all there is to the basics of Redux Toolkit. And the reason it's so welcome, like I said before, is because this is all really a lot less boilerplate code than regular Redux. So let's go ahead and look into how we would add this to our project if we were going to add Redux into its own folder. So the first thing we would do is we can create a Redux folder, and then we can go ahead and create something called setup store or configureStore. This will be a file where we can take in all the reducers, essentially, all the slices, and put them all into one place. And then we can go ahead and create a file for our slices. So we can call this like counter.js or counterslice.js, whatever you feel more comfortable doing. Let's call it counterslice. That way it's very clear that this is a slice and not a counter component itself. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to set up our actual reducer. So for example, if we come over to the intermediate tutorial, and we scroll down a bit, we can get a full example. Let's see, maybe I passed it. We can get an entire example of how they set up that store. So this is pretty much all we have to do. Let's go ahead and we can go ahead and import right here, configureStore, and then pass in the reducer. So we're going to import configureStore from Redux Toolkit. And we're going to import our slice. Whoops, we got to do this in the configureStore. We can import our counter slice. So let's just have this return the default code that they had there for the counter, just like this. And let's go ahead and import createSlice. Okay. Now we can go ahead and we can export a couple of different things. So for example, we can export, if we look at the more intermediate tutorial, the actions and the reducer separately. So for example, if I copy this, I can call counterslice.actions to get all the actions and then destructure them and then export them. And I can export the actual reducer as the default export for this file. And this is really cool because you don't want to go ahead and import the entire slice into every individual file that you want to use the action, for example. Doing like this allows you to, for example, just export the single action that you need in every single reducer, or every single place that you plan on calling a function from the reducer individually, which is really cool. So our slice is pretty much complete. As you can see here, all we've done is created it. We gave it a name. We set the initial name to initial state to be 0, and we've set up our reducers and our actions at the same time by just declaring what the action is and what it does in the same place, and we've gone ahead and exported all of them. So now let's finish up setting up our store, adding our store and our provider to our index, and then we'll be ready to actually call our variables and our functions in our application itself. So let's go back to the library. Let's scroll up and see how they are doing the actual creation of the configureStore. And as you can see here, it's pretty simple. All they're really doing is calling it and passing in the slice that you have. So let's go ahead and import the slice first. And remember, it's going to be the default export, so we can just export it like that. And we could just pass in our slice like this, but let's say, for example, in an application where we're going to have multiple slices, which is extremely possible. So let's just call this like testslice.js. I'm going to go ahead and just put some dummy data in here. In fact, I'm just going to copy the exact same thing, but just to show you guys how to pass in multiple slices into your reducer, what you could do is you could go ahead and you could call something known as combine reducers, which is also from Redux Toolkit. So I'm going to go ahead and import that, combine reducers, and then I can say const reducers, or reducer is going to be equal to combine reducers, and I'm just going to pass in all my reducers. So I can say, for example, counter is going to be our counter slice, and then let's go ahead and import test slice from the test slice I made, and we can say like the test reducer will come from that test slice. Oops, there we go. And now when we're passing in our store, we can go ahead and just pass in reducer just like that, because you would technically do this, but obviously if it has the same name, you can just pass it in once and it'll automatically make that object. And also, if you wanted to, for example, pass in the default middlewares, you don't have to add anything. But if you wanted to, for example, disable some of the default middlewares that it comes with, for example, Redux Thunk is one of the default middlewares, and in my videos I like using Redux Saga. You could do something like this. So you could go ahead and import get default middlewares, which will give you all the default middlewares that it comes with, and you can go ahead and spread that object that it gives you, and you can pass in thunk to be false. And I wonder if you could probably even disable DevTools maybe. I guess not. But for example, this will give you all the default middlewares, and then it will say, listen, I don't want thunk in these default middlewares, and it'll pass that in. So we can go ahead and save this, and let's just go ahead and export default store. So now pretty much from this point on, the last thing we have to do is create the provider in our app.js. That is going to be, or in our index.js is probably better practice. That is going to be as simple as it always has been before. And in order to do that, you are going to need the Redux, React Redux library. So we can go ahead and install that. And once that is installed, all we have to do is come over here and first import the provider from React Redux. And if you're not sure what a provider is and you're not sure why we're setting up a provider and exporting the store and stuff like that, like I said, highly recommend checking out my introduction to Redux, which will explain all of that. And it'll probably be really helpful to you to understand how Toolkit works as well, even more so than you've already seen here. And then we can also go ahead and import the store. Let's go ahead, and take it from configureStore. And then lastly, we're just going to create the provider and pass in the store. And wrap that around our app. And there we go. So now we should be able to go into one of our applications and actually, in fact, our only application, and use that use selector, the standard use selector that we've always been able to use for Redux, and take out that count variable from the Redux store, the slice. So we can go ahead and let's just come over to our app.js. Oh, we're already here. So we can say, for example, count is going to be equal to use selector state, and then we can say state dot, and what do we call? So we saw state dot counter. I believe it should just be the default. So let's go ahead and pop that in there, and there we go. We have that our count is 0. And if I come back to our counter slice and I set the initial state to like 5, you can see that it'll change to 5. And also, if I set it like this, and I had a map and I said like count is equal to like 0, for example, I could also change these actions up because we're no longer just editing the top level of the state. We can actually do what we do in regular Redux and return the entire state, because we know we only want to affect one variable in the state, and we could just make count equal to the current state.count plus 1, and then the same thing over here for the decrement. It's at -1. Now we can come ahead over here, because we are now this state.count is an actual object and we're trying to display an actual object. We can go ahead and destructure the count variable out of this counter object, and you'll see we still get it over here, just like in regular Redux. And for the increment, I can create the on clicks again. So we can call a dispatch, and in order to do dispatch, we're going to need the dispatch hook. Just like that. And then in our dispatch, we just call increment. Oops. And we can go ahead and import it, and then make sure we add 2 brackets at the end. And then the same thing for our decrement, except instead of increment, we're going to be calling decrement. Just like that. And if we start using it, we can see that it works. Now, the other last thing that I want to show you guys for Redux Toolkit, which is going to be helpful, is passing in variables into your reducer and your action. So if you remember from regular Redux, when we declared an action and a function, we also declared with it the variables that we wanted to pass in and the variables we expected. The reason this is so much less verbose is because you don't have to do that, because it will naturally take in a single variable called payload, and you can pass in an object for payload and access that object to be whatever you want. For example, let's go ahead and create another reducer over here, and we can go ahead and call this reducer something like test. And for test, instead of just getting the state, we can also get the action, and we can make this an actual function. And what we can do is we can go ahead and actually destructure whatever we want from action.payload. So let's say, for example, we're passing in like a test value. We can take that from action.payload. And then, we can do whatever we want from it. Let's just console.log it to show you guys how to actually get that value. Now I'm going to create another button, and let's go ahead and don't forget to export this action as well. I'm going to come ahead over here. I'm going to create another button that's going to be called test. And when I go ahead and click this button, I want to call the test action. And I can go, didn't import it, so let's go ahead and just manually import it. And I'm going to go ahead and pass an object, and I'm going to set test value in that object to 33. So now if I come over here and I click test, you'll see here my console log outputted 33. And that's pretty much how you can pass in any type of value and stuff that you want. Any value that you want, this is an object, so you can pass in as many keys to that object as you want and use them however you like in your actions. So it's a lot less verbose. But that is pretty much it for the basics of Redux Toolkit. Let me know what you guys think of Redux Toolkit, and if you're interested in me doing a Redux Toolkit with Redux Saga, because it is a tiny bit different than Redux. And if you're interested in that video. And like I said, if you found value in this video, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment. It helps so much with the YouTube algorithm. And I really hope you're all staying safe, and thank you guys for watching. Hope you have an amazing day.